Veronica Gonzalez. On November 6, 1995, 4-year-old Jenny Roas was found dead in the home of her aunt, Veronica Gonzalez, and her husband, Ivan. But this wasn't an ordinary case. What happened behind those walls was nothing short of horrific. Jenny, along with her siblings, had been taken in by Veronica and Ivan after her mother entered rehab. Veronica, who seemed to have more space and resources, promised to care for her niece. But instead of a safe haven, Jenny found herself trapped in a nightmare. Autopsy reports revealed the shocking details: severe burns, bruises, and internal injuries. Jenny's cause of death was blunt force trauma, but that was only the beginning of the horrors she endured. Evidence suggested that she had been forced to live in a box, hung from a hook in a closet. But the torture didn't end there. She had been burned with a hairdryer, and all of it had been done by the very people who were supposed to protect her. Veronica was arrested and charged with first-degree murder with special circumstances of torture and mayhem. In 1998, she was convicted and sentenced to death. But even now, as she sits on death row, questions remain. How could a woman entrusted with caring for a child treat her like this? What could have driven her to inflict such unimaginable cruelty on a defenseless little girl? Now, at 63 years old, Veronica Gonzalez has spent nearly 27 years on death row. And still, the full story behind her monstrous actions remains buried in silence. Susan Diane Eubanks. On October 26, 1997, Susan Diane Eubanks, a mother of 4, became the center of a tragedy that no one saw coming. What started as just another day turned into a nightmare, the unimaginable loss of 4 young lives. Each one was shot in the head by the one person who should have been their protector, Susan herself. The shock of it was beyond belief. How could a mother commit such a horrific act? After ending their lives, Susan turned the gun on herself, shooting her stomach in a desperate attempt to escape the consequences. But she didn't die. She survived. And the world was left trying to make sense of the chaos she had unleashed. When authorities arrived, they found Susan alive. Her children, however, were gone. Arrested and charged with the murders, the questions only grew louder. What drove Susan to such a dark place? Was it a sudden breakdown? Or had something been festering beneath the surface for years? The answers, it seems, remain buried with her. In 1999, Susan was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. But as California's death penalty laws shifted, so did her fate. By 2024, her sentence was reduced to life without parole. Now, at 60 years old, Susan has spent over 27 years in prison. But despite the time, she's never fully explained why she did it. Her story remains one of sorrow, mystery, and an unsolved question. How does a mother become a killer? Brittany Marlowe Holberg. November 19, 1996, marked a tragic and violent turn in the life of 80-year-old A.B. Towery Sr. In Amarillo, Texas, Brittany Marlowe Holberg, only 23 at the time, walked into Towery's home under the guise of a normal visit. But what transpired next would forever change both their lives. Holberg, struggling with addiction and living a life marked by abuse and instability, was allegedly attacked by Towery during a violent altercation. In response, she brutally attacked him with a knife, ending his life in a fit of rage. But the horror didn't stop there. Holberg, after killing Towery, took his money, $1,400, and fled the scene. She even stole his clean clothes, attempting to erase the trace of what she had just done. Captured later in Tennessee and extradited back to Texas, Holberg faced the consequences of her actions. In 1998, she was convicted of capital murder, sentenced to death. Now, nearly 26 years later, she remains on death row, a woman defined by one violent moment in a life already full of turmoil. Her story is one of tragic desperation, where a violent encounter led to a death that could never be undone, and a life forever scarred by choices that spiral out of control. Kathy Lynn Sarinana. December 25, 2005. A day that should have been filled with joy became a heartbreaking tragedy for 14-year-old Conrad Morales and 11-year-old Ricky Morales. Kathy Lynn Sarinana and her husband Raul had taken the boys into their home, but instead of offering protection, they subjected them to unimaginable abuse. Ricky's lifeless body was found hidden in a closet, and the signs of abuse were undeniable. Conrad, too, had been brutalized, his young life taken in a home where love should have existed. The details of the abuse were chilling: prolonged suffering, physical torment, and neglect that no child should ever endure. For Ricky, his death marked the end of a life full of broken promises. For Conrad, the scars of betrayal would last a lifetime. Kathy was convicted of first-degree murder for her role in Ricky's death. Her husband Raul faced similar charges. As of 2025, Kathy remains in prison, serving a life sentence, but no amount of time will undo the suffering she caused. Now, at 50 years old, Kathy's actions are etched in the memories of those who loved those boys. But the true cost of what she did can never be measured by the years behind bars. What's left behind is the legacy of loss, 2 young lives taken, and a family forever fractured by the cruelty of those they trusted most. Kimberly Cargill. June 18th, 2010. A trusted caregiver's life would be ended over something far darker than anyone could have imagined. Kimberly Cargill, a mother of 4, invited 39-year-old Cherry Walker to her home under the pretense of needing help. But instead of assistance, Cherry found herself in the middle of a deadly scheme. Kimberly, already under investigation for child abuse, had one motive in mind: silencing Cherry before she could testify against her in an ongoing child protective case. Cargill didn't just kill Cherry. She suffocated her, then set her body on fire to conceal the evidence. This brutal act left a community reeling. The woman who had once been a trusted babysitter now became a victim of an unspeakable act by the very woman she trusted. In 2012, Kimberly Cargill was convicted of capital murder for Cherry's death. As of 2025, she has spent over 14 years on death row. The true cost of Kimberly's desperation was clear that day, and it's a cost that will never be undone. Cynthia Lynn Kaufman. In the mid-1980s, Cynthia Lynn Kaufman was caught in a cycle of violence and addiction that would ultimately lead her down a dark and deadly path. By the time she was 24, she had married and started a family, but life with her new husband, James Gregory Marlowe, would quickly spiral into chaos. Kaufman and Marlowe's violent crime spree began in October 1986, and within weeks, they would leave a trail of destruction across several states. Their first victim was 32-year-old Sandra Neri, abducted and brutally murdered in Costa Mesa, California. That was just the beginning. In the following weeks, Kaufman and Marlowe killed Pamela Simmons, Karina Noah, and Lai Murray. Each victim was abducted, tortured, and murdered, their lives taken in cold blood as Kaufman and Marlowe spiraled deeper into their drug-fueled madness. It wasn't until November 14th, 1986, that their rampage finally ended. Kaufman and Marlowe were apprehended, and soon after, Cynthia Kaufman confessed to the murders. Her defense team argued that she was a victim of battered woman syndrome, manipulated and controlled by Marlowe. But the court wasn't swayed, and in 1990, Cynthia Kaufman was sentenced to death, the first woman in California to receive a death sentence since the state reinstated capital punishment in 1977. Now 35 years later, Cynthia remains on death row, a woman who once lived in the shadows of another's control. Carrie Lynn Dalton. In June 1988, Carrie Lynn Dalton found herself on a path that would forever alter the course of a woman's life and the life of another. Carrie, a 35-year-old woman with a troubled past, had already spent years struggling with addiction and criminal activities. But on this fateful night, her life would take an irreversible turn. Along with her accomplices, Carrie abducted 41-year-old Irene May, a woman they knew. What started as a robbery would escalate into a grotesque and unthinkable act of violence. Carrie and her partners didn't just hold Irene captive. they tortured her, using a battery acid and forcing the victim to endure unimaginable pain. They sealed her fate with cruelty beyond comprehension. After the abuse, they ultimately took Irene's life in the most savage way imaginable. It wasn't long before investigators closed in on Carrie and her accomplices. In 1995, Carrie Lynn Dalton was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances, including torture and lying in wait. Her role in the gruesome murder left an indelible mark on everyone who followed the case. Now, at 71 years old, Carrie has spent more than 35 years on death row. But even after decades in prison, the horror of that night remains. How far does a person have to fall to commit such brutal violence? And in the end, who bears the weight of such a crime? Those who committed it, or those who were left behind in its wake? Margaret Ann Allen. On November 6, 2005, a quiet confrontation over money escalated into a violent act that would forever mark Margaret Ann Allen's life. Living with her daughter in Titusville, Florida, Margaret suspected her former housekeeper, 51-year-old Wendy Wright, of stealing $2,000 from her purse. What should have been a simple dispute turned into something far more horrifying. Consumed by rage, Margaret attacked Wendy, violently assaulting her and then forcing household bleach and chemicals down her throat. As if that wasn't enough, she bound Wendy's mouth with duct tape and took it a step further, ending Wendy's life with a belt. The crime shocked everyone who heard about it, and investigators quickly connected Margaret to Wendy's death. By 2011, Margaret was convicted of first-degree murder, sentenced to death for the brutality of her actions. Now, nearly 14 years later, Margaret Ann Allen remains on death row, having spent years behind bars reflecting on the crime that has forever defined her. Robin Rowe. Robin Rowe was a woman who planned the death of her own family for one reason: money. On February 10, 1992, she set in motion a devastating tragedy that would take the lives of her husband, Randy, and their two young children, Joshua and Tabitha. A fire broke out in their Boise, Idaho home, killing all three. But this wasn't a random accident. The smoke alarms had been disabled, and investigators discovered that a liquid accelerant had been used to start the fire. As the investigation unfolded, more chilling details emerged. Robin had recently taken out large life insurance policies on her family members, hoping to cash in on their deaths. This wasn't the first time tragedy struck her family either. Robin had been linked to a suspicious fire years earlier in which her son, Keith, died. In March 1993, Robin Rowe was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Over 30 years later, she remains on death row, a woman whose actions were driven by the darkest of desires: greed. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime cases that leave you thinking. Your support helps us bring more of these stories to light. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.